charge! This is never gonna end.
I thought they said it would be over by Christmas.
Shut up! Let's go!
In Part 3C of this series, we shot the classification practices and discussed marksmanship awards and proficiency pay. In this video, Part 3D of the Musketry series of 1914, we'll discuss Parts 4, 5, and 6, the field firing practices. Up to this point, all shooting had been conducted on either a 30 yards, miniature, or conventional range. In Parts 4, 5, and 6, namely the individual field practices, the fire direction practices, and the collective field practices, this would be foregone, and shooting out in a suitable training area would now take place. Field firing represented perhaps the acme of military musketry, as it combined all the aspects of conventional musketry, fire positions, fire discipline, range estimation, and so on, and combined them all in a more tactical setting. These field firing practices would rob the soldier of the few crutches left to him, namely the conventional range providing known ranges to shoot at, as well as comfortable firing points, and replace them with targets placed out in natural terrain at unknown ranges, and force him to use the ground for best advantage, both in terms of battlefield survivability and for good, accurate, and effective fire to be brought onto the targets. In Parts 1, 2, and 3 of the annual qualification, shooting was conducted primarily at first and second class figure targets. These weren't used for field firing typically. Rather, the family of standalone figure targets was used. In addition, other targets such as falling plates made of iron or steel were used for certain applications, as the overall concept of range design called for. The system of scoring used in field firing wasn't as formal as that used in Parts 1, 2, or 3. Scores based on number of hits, perhaps using the 3-point per hit standard as used in earlier practices, may have been used, but the most important aspect was that there was no pass-fail score to attain. Rather, scoring was done to judge comparative results between individuals or squads as applicable for the practices.
Practice number 4 of the annual qualification was deemed individual field firing. The purpose of these practices was to enable the individual man to shoot at realistic targets at unknown ranges in a natural setting, apart from the conventional range that he had previously shot on. There were 35 rounds allotted for Part 4, to be used in application, snap, and rapid practices. What will follow is a condensed version of one of those practices.
Before we delve into the individual practices, first a synopsis as found in the text of the musketry regulations. Each firer had his own target or targets. They were at unknown distances. The firers were paired and fired alternately, coaching each other on the effect of their fire. There were targets representing an advancing enemy, and the firers themselves would move, depending on the scheme. As you will see in the demonstration, not all of these characteristics were possible, so please understand that it was in the spirit of the regulation that the practices were shot, and if you'd be so kind as to forgive any technical transgressions. I must make a comment here about the amount of ammunition I used to shoot these two practices of Part 4. Although there were only 35 rounds allotted by the book, I have indeed shot 39. Please excuse this historical transgression. In this small-scale example, a short, defensive-oriented range practice is set up with the firer at a fixed point. The targets, quote-unquote, advance towards him. The shooter is represented by the red arrow in this diagram. First, a number 2 figure appears at 100 yards, and it is engaged with 2 rounds. Then, to simulate the advance of the enemy, a series of 3 4-second exposures of a number 3 figure at 75 yards, 1 round per exposure. Next, at 50 yards, 2 7-second exposures of a disappearing number 2 with 3 rounds rapid per exposure. This is followed by 2 exposures at 25 yards of a disappearing number 4 with 2 rounds per exposure. To simulate the appearance of reinforcements, the number 2 at 100 yards is engaged again with 3 rounds. This is done from the kneeling position. Loading is done throughout automatically as required by the customary 5-round chargers. So obviously, the ranges used in this example are so short as to obviate the need for any judgment or sight setting. What it does do is illustrate the use of appearing and disappearing targets as defined in Part 2 of the Musketry regulation. So if we were to extend the ranges out to begin, say, at 400 yards, the concept of this practice would perhaps be better illustrated. Technical considerations, however, prevented me from doing this. Regardless, shooting at appearing targets in a field setting is great fun and represents yet another strength of the musketry program of 1914. Another type of shoot detailed in the regulations for field firing was one that simulated an attack with fire and movement. Although no specific details were given in the regulation on how these practices were to be structured, concepts were. Fire at unknown ranges, movement, and close-range fire amongst the usual application, rapid, and snap techniques were amongst the elements to be utilized. The version as seen here is very much my take on what a typical attack practice may have been like. Here, a short course has been set up to simulate an approach, assault, and consolidation of an enemy position. It begins with the engagement of a sentry, a number 2 figure. Then a bound is taken, putting the man into position to engage the remainder of the picket, a number 2 and a number 3 figure. The shooter moves again and takes up a position so that the main enemy force, dug into a trench, can be engaged. An approach under cover is then conducted, with the man having to engage remaining enemy at close range with bullet and bandit. Once the position is gained, a counterattack must be fended off with rapid fire. Here, the lone sentry is engaged, and after a quick advance to some cover, the remainder of the picket. Evidently, there were 4 of them. Seeing them off, and before movement can be resumed, better top up the magazine. Now, the main advance can begin. Moving at the double in marching order can be a bit of a hoof. Managing your breathing is always something that's important when trying to hit targets after a sprint. Here, the 4 number 5 targets, simulating the heads of men peering over the parapet of a trench, can be engaged. They are linked in this case to falling plates so that they react when they're hit, and gave a powerful tool to measure fire effectiveness. In this case, no further movement could happen until all the targets were knocked down. The range here was 100 yards. Here again, after any meaningful engagement, the magazine should always be topped up. With the main position neutralized, the approach can be made. For this, the bayonet would have been a constant feature. The final approach is made here, up a ditch, only to be confronted by a surprise enemy still surviving on the position. After it is engaged, the final push onto the position. In this case, a cardboard number 2 is placed on the ground to simulate a cowering enemy. With the enemy cleared from their position, a new location is sought to protect what has been taken. Suddenly, a counterattack appears in depth and is engaged with rapid fire. Now, I hadn't the means to facilitate 4 appearing targets popping up at once, so the cue for the engagement was just one, mounted on an appearing frame, with the remainder of the targets already exposed. This is perhaps the cost of doing business without a full suite of range staff. Part 5, or the fire direction practices, were an activity reserved for leaders, NCOs, and officers. Typically, a small unit, such as a section or even a half section, would be placed on the range under the direction of an NCO or officer, who would then be given the task of identifying targets by description and range, and ordering the appropriate type of fire. The techniques for doing this were discussed in Part 2 of this series, as was the amount of ammunition used for Part 5. It was taken from the 25 rounds per man surplus that was built in to the ammunition allocation for the entire annual qualification. What follows is a demonstration at somewhat shortened range.
200. Slightly left. Rise in tree line. Enemy scouts. 2 rounds. Fire.
You will at once notice the deliberate rate at which the men fire in accordance with their orders. In this example, a faster, more decisive engagement with rapid fire.
100. Slightly right. Enemy on forward slope. 3 rounds. Rapid. Fire.
Part 6, or the collective field practices, were executed in very much a similar fashion to Part 4, the individual field practices, with one obvious exception. They were conducted as a group.
So much emphasis is placed historically on the individual shooting capabilities of the Army at the time. But actually, when you examine it, shooting and moving with live ammunition up to company level is perhaps more a measure of the shooting effectiveness of the BEF in 1914 than anything else. Truly, this type of endeavor would not be out of place even today. Here, good, accurate shooting of the appropriate type, effective direction of that fire by NCOs and officers, in target description and most importantly range, were combined with movement of moderately sized groups of men, which would have to communicate, coordinate, develop, and execute tactical plans while shooting live on the range. Pretty advanced stuff. Perhaps indicative of the importance of this part, there were just as many rounds allotted to this as for Part 3, the classification practices, to which were attached pay and status. 50 rounds was the allotment. It was recommended that collective field practices be carried out to include long-range engagement, that over 600 yards, as the fire from the group was much more observable than the individual in those circumstances. The text of Part 6 is full of what are really quite modern concepts. Starting at a lower level, they would progress taking each phase of an operation, say the attack, in sequence. By the end of the endeavor, whole companies, sometimes including the support of artillery, were exercised in comprehensive live-fire schemes. Here we see men from a cavalry regiment deploying to engage an enemy. Now, this is a training scheme against a live enemy, and thus not using live ammunition, but serves to demonstrate what a group of men coming into action look like. Movement combined with fire, and covered by fire, if in the face of the enemy, was fundamental to these complex and arguably most important of schemes.
3 rounds, rapid, fire!
So that completes Part 3D of the Musketry of 1914 series. It's my sincere hope that this series thus far has proven to be interesting and worthwhile to those wanting to explore the realities of the shooting prowess of the BEF of 1914. The men that marched to war in that momentous summer were generally good shots. They were well drilled and trained extensively in the application of fire on the battlefield, and this was twinned with what was, for its time, a very good appreciation of fieldcraft. Now that we've taken this detailed examination of the musketry program of 1914, we can, in the next part, Part 4 of the series, discuss the myths and realities of rapid shooting in the British Army of 1914. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below.